Just when Keir Starmer thought victory was within reach, his past comes roaring back. Old decisions, buried controversies, and unanswered questions are resurfacing at the worst possible time. And what voters are now discovering could change everything.
Welcome to Power and Policy UK, the channel where political power meets the policies shaping Britain's future. No spin, no slogans, just the stories behind the headlines. Tonight, a political storm is gathering in Britain, and at the centre of it stands a man who has spent years carefully polishing an image of calm competence and quiet authority. Sir Keir Starmer has worked hard to present himself as the safe pair of hands, the grown-up in the room, the man who represents a clean break from chaos. But politics has a long memory, and at what many are calling the worst possible moment, parts of Starmer's past are being dragged back into the spotlight, forcing uncomfortable questions that refuse to go away. For months, Starmer's message has been simple: stability, responsibility, and a promise that he is not who his critics say he is. He's pitched himself as a former chief prosecutor who understands the law, a family man who believes in public service, and a leader who has supposedly moved his party on from its most divisive years. Yet, as the pressure mounts and scrutiny intensifies, opponents are reminding voters that this story did not begin yesterday, and that Starmer's political and professional history is far more complicated than the carefully curated image suggests. Let's rewind. Before frontline politics, Keir Starmer made his name as a lawyer and later as Director of Public Prosecutions. Supporters describe this as proof of seriousness and integrity. Critics, however, argue that this period raises deeply uncomfortable questions about judgment, priorities, and accountability. Decisions made during that time have been dissected again and again, not just by political rivals, but by victims groups, journalists, and even former colleagues. While defenders insist he followed the law and the evidence as it stood, critics say that being technically correct is not the same as being morally right. One of the most persistent lines of attack focuses on how institutions handled sensitive and traumatic cases during his tenure. Opponents argue that the system failed vulnerable people, and they point to Starmer's leadership role as evidence that he should bear responsibility, even if indirectly. His allies respond by saying he inherited problems, worked within strict legal frameworks, and even introduced reforms. But in politics, perception often matters as much as fact, and for many voters, the idea that mistakes were made under his watch is enough to plant doubt. Then there is Starmer, the politician, a man whose ideological journey has left critics calling him slippery and untrustworthy. He rose to prominence within his party during a period of intense internal conflict, presenting himself as a unifying figure while aligning with positions that energized the base. Over time, however, many of those positions were quietly softened, reinterpreted, or abandoned altogether. Supporters frame this as pragmatism and growth. Detractors see something darker, a willingness to say whatever is necessary to gain power. Former allies have not been shy about voicing their anger. Some accuse Starmer of benefiting from radical promises only to discard them once they became inconvenient. Policies once championed were suddenly described as unrealistic. Commitments once hailed as moral imperatives were rebranded as optional aspirations. To critics, this pattern suggests not leadership but calculation. And now, as old speeches, interviews, and campaign pledges resurface online, the contrast between then and now is impossible to ignore.
The timing could not be worse. With the country facing economic uncertainty, strained public services, and widespread distrust in politics, voters are already sceptical. Starmer's entire pitch relies on trust. Trust that he means what he says now, trust that he has learned from the past, trust that he represents something different. Every resurfaced clip, every revived controversy chips away at that foundation. Even if the accusations are familiar, repetition has power, especially when amplified across social media and partisan outlets. There is also the question of principle. Starmer has often spoken about ethics, standards, and restoring faith in public life. Yet critics argue that his own record reveals selective morality. They point to moments when he appeared slow to act against problematic behavior within his party, only taking decisive steps when public pressure became unbearable. Supporters argue this shows caution and respect for due process. Opponents say it shows weakness, or worse, political self-preservation. And then there's the broader narrative that his enemies are eager to push, that Starmer represents the establishment he claims to challenge. Knighted for his services, educated, polished, and deeply embedded in elite institutions, he is portrayed by critics as out of touch with ordinary people's struggles. They argue that his past career choices and political maneuvering reveal a man more comfortable with power than with protest, more interested in managing the system than transforming it. To be fair, none of this exists in a vacuum. British politics has become brutally polarised, and every major figure carries baggage. Starmer's defenders are quick to point out that many of the attacks rely on selective memory, exaggeration, or outright bad faith. They argue that he is being held to an impossible standard, judged not just on what he did, but on what others wish he had done. They remind audiences that leadership is about making difficult choices in imperfect circumstances. Still, the phrase horrific past has traction for a reason. It speaks not necessarily to a single scandal, but to a cumulative sense of unease. It's the idea that when you line up all the controversies, reversals, and unresolved questions, a pattern begins to emerge that voters cannot easily dismiss. Whether fair or not, that pattern is now being weaponized with ruthless efficiency. What makes this moment especially dangerous for Starmer is that he can't simply brush it off as ancient history. Much of what's being discussed is relatively recent, still relevant, and directly connected to the values he claims to embody today. Apologies, explanations, and context may satisfy some, but for others they reinforce the sense that there is always another clarification, another footnote, another reason why things aren't quite as straightforward as they seem. The media environment only amplifies the problem. In an age of viral clips and shortened attention spans, nuance is often the first casualty. A complex legal explanation or a long-winded defense doesn't travel nearly as fast as a damning quote or a provocative headline. Starmer's critics know this, and they are betting that enough doubt, repeated often enough, will stick. Yet there is a deeper question lurking beneath the noise. What do voters actually want from a leader? Do they demand ideological purity and unwavering consistency, or are they willing to accept evolution and compromise? Do they judge a politician by the worst decisions made under their watch, or by how they respond when challenged? Starmer's past forces these questions into the open, and the answers will vary dramatically depending on who you ask. For some, his record is proof of experience, resilience, and the ability to operate at the highest levels of the state. For others, it is evidence of moral failure, political opportunism, and a lack of conviction.
The same facts can tell wildly different stories depending on the lens through which they are viewed. What is undeniable is that this is a defining moment. Starmer can no longer rely solely on the promise of being not the other guy. He is being judged on his own history, his own choices, and his own words. The past he hoped to keep neatly filed away has collided head-on with his ambitions for the future. As the noise grows louder, the risk is not just electoral damage, but a deeper erosion of credibility. If voters conclude that Starmer is constantly rewriting his own story, they may begin to question everything he says, including the policies and promises aimed at the future. Trust, once lost, is painfully difficult to rebuild. And that is why this matters now, not in some abstract historical sense, but in the very real context of a country desperate for leadership it can believe in. Whether Starmer's past is truly horrific or simply politically inconvenient will ultimately be decided by the public, but the fact that these questions are being asked loudly and persistently suggests that the reckoning he hoped to avoid has finally arrived. In politics, timing is everything, and for Keir Starmer, the resurfacing of these controversies at this precise moment may prove to be the most serious test of his leadership yet. You've been watching Power and Policy UK. If you want real insight into who holds power and how policy affects your life, subscribe, like, and stay informed.